Hello, today we're talking about getting set and some due diligence that you're going to want to do as an auctioneer. How do you protect yourself? How do you protect your company? So we're going to dive right into it, just a few short examples to show you and things that you're going to want to get prepared for. First off, we sent you our policies and we've sent you a link to the knowledge base, and what we really want you to do is make sure you know and understand what those policies are. They're there for our protection and for yours and for our buyers and sellers. The policies are there. They're pretty black and white. If you ever have any questions, please contact us. If there's anything that's iffy that you want to discuss and get clarity, let us know. The knowledge base just has a ton of information for affiliates, really on anything from sales to marketing to policy questions to how to use the software itself. So do take advantage of that. If you have things that you want added or topics that you think we should cover, let us know and we'll look into that as well. Secondly, for due diligence, I want to touch on a topic of the UCC code 2-328 and why that's important for what we do. Now, this is the federal law that governs sale by auction. So in the unfortunate event that you would get into some kind of a lawsuit, this is the mandate, or this is the verbiage that is used to establish law across the country. This is it too. There's nothing more on auction law that's written in the UCC book, I guess, that covers these topics. So it's important for you to know that and understand what each one means. So it's really just 4 lines, and I'll just go through them real quick and explain what they mean. First off, in a sale by auction, if goods are put up in lots, each lot is subject of a separate sale. So basically that means in an online auction, if we have 50 lots, we technically have 50 different auctions. So that is important to understand that differentiation. A sale by auction is complete when the auctioneer so announces by fall of the hammer or another customary manner. Where a bid is made while the hammer is falling in acceptance of a prior bid, the auctioneer may in his discretion reopen the bidding or declare the goods sold under the bid on which the hammer was falling. What does this mean? This means when an online auction closes and a bidder is named the winning bidder, that's the end of the story. So, this may not be an issue. I'll give you an example. So say you're selling out a mechanic shop and a compressor is being sold and it sells for $500. The buyer gets there and it turns out that the seller didn't want to sell that item, and he's pulled it from the sale. He's taken it away from the auction itself. By law, you are forced to sell it to that bidder. If you were sued by that buyer, you would likely lose that lawsuit. So it's important to really make sure that your seller understands what the implications are of your contracts, which we're going to talk about, and of what liabilities you have out there. So making sure that the items that we have for sale, once they're announced sold and winning bidders are invoiced and announced, that we have access to those items and that we can transfer the ownership of those items to the new buyer. Number 3, such a sale is with reserve unless otherwise noted. So unless we state otherwise, every auction is with reserve unless we state no reserve or absolute. So why is this important, or how is this important? In KBID, we note that any item with a reserve has to be programmed within the system beforehand. So buyers know if an item has a reserve and they know the status of that. Technically, if we didn't have any reserve wording in there and we did not disclose or state no reserve or absolute auction, technically every item on that auction would be with reserve in regards to the law. Now, that's not exactly how we operate. We require that if there's a reserve on an item, it must be programmed into the system. But why is this important? If you are promoting an auction as no reserve or absolute, which is a great way to promote auctions because it drives the most interest and the most traffic. But warning to you, you cannot pull any single items from that auction because they cannot be withdrawn after a bid is placed. So Be very careful if you're using that verbiage and that wording, because due to the law, that you can get into some hot water there. Lastly, if the auctioneer knowingly receives a bid on the seller's behalf, or the seller makes or procures such a bid and notice has not been given that liberty or for such bidding is reserved, the buyer may at his option avoid the sale or take the goods at the last bid price of good faith. Sellers are not allowed to bid on their auctions. KBID does not allow it as far as the general terms across the board, but the law doesn't allow it either. And if that is the case, it needs to be explicitly stated in the terms. So it's not something that we allow, and it's also something that federal and state law doesn't allow as well. So I just wanted to go through that with you real quick to give you some background into auction law. And if there's the unfortunate reality or unfortunate circumstance that you end up in a courtroom, this is going to be a lot of what decisions are based off of. And if you want to learn more about this, you can always look it up. There's a number of great resources out there online as well. All right, next fun topic. Due diligence as an auctioneer. How do I know if my seller owes money on the assets being sold? Could I be held liable if I sell them and the owner doesn't have the right to sell them or he doesn't own them? Now, that is a great question, but I'm going to answer the first one first. How do I know if my seller owes money on assets being sold? The only way that you can absolutely find out is by running a UCC search on that seller, on their name. A UCC financing statement is basically a titling system for non-titled items. So when you think of a vehicle, a truck that you purchase from the dealership, if you take out a loan, there's a lien on that title. But if I buy an air compressor for my business, it's $5,000. There's not a title there. So how do banks and financial institutions make sure that other entities know that there's money owed on these items? They file UCC filings, and that could be on specific assets. It could be on a blanket line of credit. They're required to make these filings if they have any interest in the assets of a company or an individual. So that's good for us as auctioneers, because we want to make sure that we do our due diligence and know what we're selling is in fact in ownership of the seller. They have the ability to sell it and legally can sell it and receive the funds for it. So what you're going to want to do in your state is run UCCs on the business name and individual name. Now, this is done at the Secretary of State. Most of it can be done online. So you run a UCC search, on the seller name, and we would always do it on the individual name as well, because when you get into LLCs and other types of businesses, it could be under the individual and not necessarily the business. Some states may charge for you to run those reports, but it's well worth it. And what you're going to see when you run a UCC report is it's going to show you what assets have a filing on them, and which banks and which financial institutions have a interest in those items. So what we would do when we were running auctions is we would run that report, and if we saw anything that we're selling on that auction, we'd reach out directly to the bank, and we'd have the conversation with the seller as well, saying, hey, we found this in a UCC search. What's the status on this loan? Doesn't really matter what they say. We're going to contact the bank anyway, just to make sure that we're good to go. So we would require that the bank send us a letter in their letterhead and signed by someone in the company stating you have the ability to sell these assets, or you do not have the ability to sell these assets because there's still an outstanding loan. Typically, if there's enough value in the item to cover whatever the withstanding loan amount is, the bank will give you permission to sell and make sure that proceeds, or at least up to the loan amount, is paid out to the bank. So this can get a little bit tricky, but don't be afraid to call a bank if you see that they're listed on a UCC for an auction that you're running. Even if it's really messy, they will work with you. Sometimes if it's a situation where the seller owes way more than what the asset values are, the best situation for that bank is to go through with the auction. And now your seller is no longer the person who's getting the check. It's going directly to the bank, and your contract might be changed to going with the bank as well. So we would run these reports on any auctions that we were doing above 20 grand, because we didn't want to, pay out anyone that wasn't supposed to be paid, and God forbid, be held liable for paying the wrong entity and having to pay off twice. The other thing that we do to cover ourselves is on the contract, we require that the seller states that they own these assets free and clear of any liens and encumbrances. So, that's your first check, or your first protection. The second one is to run the UCC report in your state, in the state of where the business is operating, to make sure that all the liens have been perfected and you can pay that seller. Other things for auctioneers, just doing your own due diligence. Be on the lookout for anything that looks too good to be true. If someone comes to you with a trailer full of tools and they all have a company name on them and they want them sold in 3 days and they don't care what it sells for, there's probably something going on there. Stolen items, it does happen rarely. If you have any inclination that something off is going on, that's when you're going to want to, ask more questions, figure out what the situation is, look into this seller. Don't worry about, every item that's coming in on consignment as being stolen, but, have your eyes open and just look for anything that looks off. Also, fake or replica items. We've had some issues with purses, coins, cards, autographs, precious metals. People will prey on different auctioneers and try to sell these fake items. They'll be from out of state and they'll be sending you stuff saying, hey, can you sell this for me? It's a signed baseball card that's worth $20,000. Well, no one in their right mind is probably going to send a baseball card worth that much to someone who they've never met and with no previous experience with. So just be very careful, be on the lookout for that. And use your best judgment in those situations. There's a lot to consider when you're taking in consignments. One other thing I would do if you're selling firearms, if you have an FFL or if you're working through an FFL, is you can call in different serial numbers for firearms to local law enforcement, and they can run a report to see if any of those have been registered as stolen. I know there's a few affiliates out there that will do that. If they're selling firearms, for everything that they take in, they'll send over the serial numbers and have the local law enforcement run those and just make sure everything's clear and good to go. All right, that should be it for this section. We'll talk to you soon.